Okay, welcome everybody. I'm very excited to announce the very first interview on the YouTube channel. The channel is devoted, as you know, as some of you know, to a large part to theoretical psychology books, and I'm beginning a series of new videos interviewing people who have been engaged as contributors to the field of theoretical psychology. Today, I will be speaking with Professor Mark Freeman. Mark Freeman is professor of psychology at the College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. And I'm sorry for my mispronunciations occasionally. Feel free to.
That was pretty good.
Okay, Worcester, Massachusetts. And distinguished professor of ethics and society. His books include Rewriting the Self, History, Memory, and Narrative, published by Routledge in 1993. Finding the Muse, a Sociopsychological Inquiry into the Conditions of Artistic Creativity, Cambridge, 1994. Hindsight, The Promise and Peril of Looking Backward, published by Oxford in 2010. The Priority of the Other, Thinking and Living Beyond the Self, again, Oxford, 2014. And many articles and chapters about topics including memory, identity, psychology of art, psychology of religion. And he has also been the winner of the 2010 Theodore R. Sarbin Award in the Society for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. He is also series editor for the Oxford University Press series, Explorations in Narrative Psychology. Okay, welcome, Professor Freeman.
Nice to be here.
So I would like to begin by asking you about your journey in psychology. This could include your formal academic training, significant teachers that you met or courses, significant books. And I wonder, because some people have divided their psychological journey into two phases. First is the encounter with psychology in general, the discipline of psychology, and then finding this area of theoretical and philosophical psychology. If it is fair to divide into those two parts, I'm curious to know in general.
Well, I think it's not only fair, but I think for a number of the people you'll speak to, that's pretty much how they would divide it too. So I'll begin more or less at the beginning. I was an undergraduate at what was then called the State University of New York at Binghamton, now called Binghamton University, and that was back in 1973. And I can't recall whether I knew I was going to be a psychology major from the start, but it was certainly something I gravitated toward. And so I took some of the standard fare. I took introductory psychology and a couple of other courses, and was taken aback, quite honestly, by what it was and what it wasn't. I had somewhat naively assumed that it was going to be the deep study of the interior life, and that it would help me and my friends and all the rest of us reflect on things that were important and understand the features of the human condition. And while that was a part of it, it really wasn't a big part of it. It was the heyday of behaviorism at the university where I was, and the classes were big and somewhat anonymous, and I had trouble initially finding my way. So the question became, what do I do about that? And you know, I took courses in other disciplines. I took courses in literature, which I very much enjoyed. I took courses in philosophy, which I also enjoyed, but I wound up sticking with psychology because at its best, it still seemed like it was something worth pursuing. But I didn't know how far I'd be able to go with it, largely because I really did find much of it quite alienating. And even back then, I guess I could say I admired some of it, but I found that it left major regions of the human experience out. I was fortunate enough to take two classes in particular that allowed me to find a somewhat different approach to psychology. One was a class in the psychology department. It was actually a class in visual thinking, which featured the work of the psychologist of art, Rudolf Arnheim. And it had us reading things like Gestalt psychology and some other forms of psychology that were somewhat more holistic in their orientation, somewhat more inclusive of the human experience, made contact with art, and so on. So that was cool. The other course that I took that really was formative was a course in Phenomenological Psychology, and that was in the philosophy department. And it was taught by a Merleau-Ponty scholar named Martin Dillon. And that really was eye-opening. Some of it was quite dense. We read the work of Aaron Gurevich in that course, and that's pretty dense. What I find in my way, how do I go about extending that path? How do I do that? I took off about 3 years after college, partly to do some exploring in Europe and throughout the States and so forth, and also partly to find places that might be suitable for me pursuing my own developing interests, which were pretty much at the intersection of psychology and philosophy. In the end, it came down to two places, Duquesne University and the University of Chicago. Duquesne University was well known at the time and still remains well known for being really one of the main programs, if in fact one of the only programs in, quote, existential phenomenological psychology. It's extended its reach in recent years in the wake of postmodernism and post-structuralism and so on. So I don't know if they wave that exact flag anymore, but that was certainly a possibility. The question there was, do I really know I want to be an existential phenomenologist? Is this, am I going to want to be reading Husserl and Heidegger and what about all the other stuff that's out there? So Chicago offered a very different kind of program. It was one of their interdisciplinary committees, the Committee on Human Development, which was a mixture of the various social sciences, featuring psychology first, but it also was a program that allowed us to freely explore other disciplines. In fact, out of the 27 or so courses that were required for the degree, only 9 were required actually within the committee. And so some people ventured more into sociology or political science. I wound up doing some of that, but also ventured significantly into philosophy. I went to Chicago for a couple of reasons, partly because it did have a space for the likes of me. There were a number of people who were doing work in the broad area of existential phenomenological psychology, as well as some others. In terms of the people who were most formative, I did some research and really became a colleague and friend ultimately of Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, who is the author of Flow,
Right.
Among other works. And other people in the committee who were important to me were Bert Kohler, who was a psychoanalyst, Rick Schwader, who is a cognitive anthropologist, and a number of others. In terms of who really inspired the work I eventually came to do, there were a couple people. One was Gene Genlin, who actually was in the Department of Behavioral Sciences, but taught me courses including phenomenological method and theory construction, and in his own unique way really was an inspiration. But I would say my main philosophical inspiration was Paul Ricoeur. Paul Ricoeur was in the Committee on Social Thought, he was in the Department of Philosophy, and he was also in the Divinity School, which was actually his main home. And I knew about his work before I got to Chicago, but really was not an expert in it by any means. But I knew I had to try to study with him. And in order to study with him, one had to apply and give reasons, because a lot of students were clamoring for his attention. And so I applied and made my case, and I wound up being able fairly early on in my career at Chicago to take a 2-semester seminar in the phenomenology of time, phenomenology of time consciousness, I guess. And it was a challenge. I was the only, quote, social scientist in that class. It was mainly people from philosophy and divinity who were much better schooled in the history of ideas at that point than I was. But it was a trip. It was great. You know, we all had to do class presentations. I did my first presentation on book 10 of St. Augustine's Confessions, which was on memory. Second semester, I did a presentation on Husserl's lectures on internal time consciousness and so on. So that was great. It was kind of amazing. I also wound up taking a 2-semester course with Ricoeur, the theologian David Tracy, the philosopher of science Stephen Toulmin, who I reference in some of my work, and another theologian, Langdon Gilkey, and that was called Historicity, History, and Narrative. And it was philosophy of history and historiography and narrative theory and psychoanalysis and all kinds of things. And I wound up taking a couple other courses also. I took a course called Mythical Time, which Ricoeur taught alongside the great historian of religions, Mircea Eliade. And I audited another one, I think it was called The Critique of Subjectivity. So it was amazing stuff. You know, in the Committee on Human Development, I was learning a lot about life history and how we might understand human beings in an appropriately comprehensive and multidimensional way from birth to death. And in my philosophy courses, I was learning a lot about the history beyond the individual life and how to think about historical understanding and the part that narrative played in it, and so on. So it was a kind of remarkably fortuitous confluence of things. And you know, that's what my education there was like, and it really was extraordinary. And I suppose it's possible that I have inflated it in some way looking backward, but I don't think so. It was a very, very heady time. I was bursting with ideas. I was somewhat audacious, feeling like I had something to say at a relatively early career age, I guess one could say. But I kind of had to. And so I wound up writing about this kind of stuff maybe 3 or 4 years into graduate school. The first piece I ever did was a piece called History, Narrative, and Lifespan Developmental Knowledge that came out in the Journal of Human Development, and that was followed by a piece that I was asked to do by the editor there on the work of Paul Ricoeur. So, you know, I was kind of off and running, and people read that stuff and they eventually invite you to things. And one person asked me eventually to do a book for his book series and so on. So it was great. It was cool. The question, of course, after that is, how do you get a job? And the prospects were, I don't know, I guess I would actually say they were dim in a way, mainly because there were very, very few places that would have wanted a real interdisciplinary person, scholar, the likes of me. And that's still true today. As luck would have it, I saw an advertisement back in 1986 from the College of the Holy Cross, basically looking for somebody who did what I do, you know, wanted somebody to do phenomenological psychology, teach the history and theory of psychology, and other things related to a more humanistic approach to psychology. And it was, I mean, you see a job ad like that once a decade or something. So, you know, I worked my way to get there. But finding a job like this, some of it's just dumb luck, being in the right place at the right time. And I say that partly because there were some really first-rate scholars at Chicago who were never able to find a comparably good position, partly because they fell between the cracks of the disciplines. You know, they might be too philosophical for psychology, too psychological for philosophy. You know, none of us came out with the kind of pure pedigree that a lot of places continue to seek. But Holy Cross, which is a Jesuit and Catholic school that prides itself on exploring fundamental religious and philosophical questions, always had, or at least in recent years, had a space for somebody like me. And so I've been here. This is my 34th year. And I've taught all kinds of things, ranging from history and theory of psychology, which was what I was hired to teach, psychology of art, psychology and literature, existential psychology, psychology of religion, and so on. So, like all places, there have been bumps along the way, but all things considered, I feel very fortunate to have landed here, continuing to do the things that interest me and having people even pay me for that.
Great, great. In the beginning, when you were describing your experience as a psychology student in the beginning of your journey, you mentioned this word alienating, which I think is a very, very appropriate word, and I think a lot of us experiencing that. And if you don't mind, I'd like to explore that concept a little bit more. And is it correct to say that a discipline like psychology would be alienating if what we study and we hope to find some traces of ourselves in it when we study, especially psychology, because it is not like chemistry. When we gain knowledge of chemistry, we don't expect to find things that are familiar, or we find some things about ourselves and then confirms some of our intuitions. When in psychology, it's that distance between our lived experience, and we find none of, in some parts of psychology, we just don't find any of it. And the contrast in the phenomenological tradition, that's the contrast, because it's some of the things that are accessible to us, they're available. The phenomenological tradition makes it more explicit, brings it more to light. So it was really interesting that you moved from psychology to the phenomenological tradition and studying with Ricoeur. And
so I'll say a little bit about that alienation. I mean, and this is also partly how I discuss the issue with my students even now. What I say to them, because I have no interest in overly distancing myself from my colleagues here at Holy Cross or mainstream psychology and so on. What I say to them is I have no particular problem with what gets done in psychology. I have more of a problem with what doesn't get done.
Right.
Basically tended to stick with those kinds of phenomena that were most readily objectifiable and most readily measured. And I understand the reason for that. But at the same time, it struck me then, and I still believe it's the case now, that many of the most important human phenomena are not so readily objectifiable and are not so readily measured. And so out of the vast range of things that psychology might study, our interests, our passions, art, life, meaning, its in a way that was problematic and tragic almost, because I think there were a lot of students then, as there are now, who are hungry for something more, for making sense of the world, their world, the world of others, and so on. And I would say we have better tools now to do that than we had back in 1973 to 1977. But the situation isn't vastly different. It's still a challenge to find places who are willing to look at the human experience in all of its messiness and ambiguity. There are relatively few of them. It's still a challenge to bring qualitative inquiry into a modern psychology department, even if people are philosophically pluralistic, and so on. So what I learned was interesting, but it just seemed to me to leave out vast regions of the human experience that could be and should be studied, but probably couldn't be studied in quite the same way that those measurations were, right? So I really knew nothing about qualitative inquiry back then. But I had an intuition about its importance back then, because it was clear that the standard fare that one might find in a traditional statistics or research methods course was unlikely to get me where I wanted to go.
I had this analogy when I read some of your articles and chapters on the poetic position in psychology. And you also describe how it is the problem is not with what is actually done, but what is not done. And actually, I think part of that insight is a transition between the approaches. So, for example, we have like 3 games. We have baseball, soccer, and basketball, for example.
Right.
But the space of possible games is larger than that. And your poetic psychology reminded me of this larger space, which has space for these other activities, but also how those activities emerge in the first place.
Right.
How, for example, neuroscience is formed, how its assumptions are formed, and how it relates to its own assumptions and its new discoveries.
Yeah, yeah. You know, what I sometimes say to my students is, psychology didn't have to become this. It didn't have to be this. And again, that's not to discount what gets done. It's to say there's a lot of other things it could have been. But, you know, beginning with Wundt and others, it wound up acquiring the particular trajectory that it has. And of course, I think Wundt and others who were working at that time became progressively more, quote, important, the more experimental psychology became, right? In that sense, it was a founding that happened retroactively, one might say. You know, it's interesting that you mentioned neuroscience. I mean, there's interesting and good work being done in neuroscience, including some of the work that's being done in my own department. It seems to me that some of the deep motives behind neuroscience are not unlike some of the deep motives behind, for instance, behaviorism. And that might sound like a strange comparison, but I think, again, has to do with the notion of what can be objectified, what can be seen in a way. And, you know, on some level, we can see what's going on in the brain. We can look at fMRIs. We can do all kinds of things that do indeed give us some measure of objective knowledge. And so just as the behaviorists turn to behavior as a kind of antidote to looking at inner life, or as an alternative because of its visibility and its observability and all the rest, there's a sense in which the turn to neuroscience does much the same thing. It's not looking at behavior, it's looking at what's going on biochemically, neurologically, and so on. And I think for some people, that's the promised land. And I think some people imagine that someday that's what psychology will be. My own conviction is that insofar as that's what psychology becomes, it will have given up the great challenge of studying experience. And I think there's little question but that the brain is the material condition without which there would be no experience, right?
Of course.
In that sense, one could even say, you know, I'm a qualified materialist. But there still remains experience as such and how to understand it in what I would call a properly psychological way. You know, a lot of this has to do with psychology's fundamental aims and aspirations, methodologically, philosophically, epistemologically, and so on. And those aspirations continue to point in the direction of science, basically of a natural science sort.
Right.
Seems to me. And that's true even in the social sciences.
Right. I read books on neuroscience and neuropsychology partly for teaching purposes. Yeah. And I noticed this thing. I mean, neuroscience, the practice and attitude of neuroscience could be examined as a kind of human experience. And when I see it that way, when I pay attention to the language of books on neuroscience, especially books that go to the direction of being for the popular audience, right, readership, it always has this flavor of we are beginning to understand so and so. It always has that, like, we are at the verge of breakthrough. And it has that promissory tone, usually in neuroscientific research and the neuroscience talks. It always has that future directedness. It tends to, what actually is delivered by it is relatively speaking insignificant compared to what it promises. And it promises a great deal. It promises a great translation of everything in the language of neuroscience.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I mean, I mean, some progress is being made. And maybe by virtue of the fact that some progress is being made, you know, it points for some to the kind of promised land of arrival, right? That bit by bit, we're going to finally crack the code of the human condition. You know, I understand why it is that people might think that, and if that gives them hope and motivation to continue their work, more power to them.
Sure.
But I think the ultimate translational feat is unlikely to come. And interestingly enough, and it's partly because I've been teaching Wundt fairly recently, it was clear that translational feat couldn't happen. Even to him, it was clear, right? And that's because the material and the psychical are two different spheres and warrant two different approaches. You know, he says at one point in the lectures on animal and human psychology, no system of cosmic mechanics will be able to show us how it is that the material world gets translated into the world of thought, feeling, idea, volition, and so on. That doesn't mean it's irrelevant. Have at it. But don't assume that you're going to have a sufficient explanation and understanding of human experience by virtue of what you do on the material level.
I wanted to also ask you about this distinction between a psychology that is artful and a psychology that is not artful, a psychology that is poetic and a psychology that is natural, scientific. And maybe the distinction is, as we said, one could be a subset of the other. So
yeah,
we can talk about what happens to psychology when it becomes non-poetic and what is added to it when it becomes poetic.
Yeah. Yeah, the way I sometimes talk about it is for much of psychological knowledge, words are used primarily for informational purposes, right? And in the kind of approach that I'm proposing, the words themselves matter, and they matter not only in an informational sense or a communicative sense, but also in an expressive sense. And I want to be clear when I use terms like poetic science or poetic psychology. I'm not suggesting that psychology should become, you know, florid and ornamental or something like that. But if we think about what it is that great literature does, right? I mean, if we want to really learn something about the depths of the human experience in its messiness and ambiguity and all the rest, as I put it before, we're likely to turn to a great writer or a great artist. We're not likely to turn to the latest experimental psychology article.
Right.
And that's fine. There's a division of labor. There are people who write novels and poems, and there are people who do psychology. But the question I wound up posing for myself is, why can't a portion of psychology be as, in a sense, revelatory of the human condition as great works of literature? And my answer was, it can do that, and it should do that in at least a portion of what it does. And when we think about works of literature, when we think about poems, or when we think about paintings, the words matter, right? They're not just transparent vehicles for the communication of an idea that could have been communicated in a number of ways. I mean, the sensuous tonality of words, their musicality and so forth, those help bring us closer to the lived fabric of experience. And so, you know, I'm not as wedded to the idea of poetic science as I once was, for reasons I can explain later. But, you know, I have tried to suggest that the kind of approach that I have proposed is in some ways more scientific rather than less scientific. More scientific insofar as it seeks to practice fidelity to life as we actually live it, rather than cordoning off life in the more contrived situation of the experiment or the interview or whatever. So and my argument there is insofar as the first responsibility of science is to be faithful to its object, well, much of psychology hasn't been particularly scientific. And that perhaps by moving in this more artful direction, we can get that much closer in a way to the fabric of lived experience.
Mm-hmm.
And again, it's. I try not to be too binary about this. I mean, I don't need to call what I do anything in particular, although sometimes it helps to do that. Initially, there was actually a kind of political reason. Well, there were two reasons for my calling it poetic science. First was political. If as a younger scholar especially, I was to come out and say, this has nothing to do with science, this is an entirely different thing than what you all do, people would have said, go away. Who the hell are you? And so calling it science was partly my way of kind of staying in the game. Mm-hmm. and declaring, hey, what I do is science too, albeit of a different sort than you. Mm-hmm. The deeper rationale is that I really did believe and do believe that the discipline is in need of a much more inclusive and capacious conception of science than the one it operates with, and that by moving in this more poetic direction, we could have a fuller and more inclusive science and more inclusive idea of science than the one we have. Mm-hmm. If there's a reason for why I don't wave that flag quite as visibly as I once did, it's because I found myself asking in more recent years, why does everything we do have to be called science anyway? Mm-hmm. Much of it is, that's fine, but rather than jamming all of this stuff under the already crowded umbrella of science, why don't we just say some of it's something else? Right. I mean, I'm busy at work. I've written a lot about my mother, for instance. My mother had dementia for about 12 years. I wrote a number of pieces throughout the course of her dementia. And I'm in the process of writing a book on her. And it's hard to locate it in any particular category, right? I mean, I'll make contact with some of the available literature on dementia, but I'm not a dementia scholar. And so almost everything that I've learned about dementia, especially in relation to issues of memory and identity and selfhood and time, I've learned through my experience with her. Mm-hmm. And so what I need to do as a psychologist, and especially as a writer, I need to find words that are going to allow me to really have her live on the page, as I've put it in some pieces.
This relates to something you said previously.
Yeah.
Finding words. You said that the form, the how we say something, you can also say the medium. The way something is said is
right.
part of the meaning of what it is. And
I think that's right.
And to decide in advance what kind of thing it is that we want to say is to determine too much, to predetermine too much, or
right.
in advance the nature of the message.
Yeah.
I think what you're emphasizing is instead of deciding in advance what it is that the outcome of our work is, we can just do it, focus on the form, focus on the how,
right.
As opposed to the final content.
Yeah, and it's partly a matter of being faithful to the phenomena, but it's also partly a matter of creating more of an interpretive space for readers, right? I mean, a work of art or a work of literature that's too didactic or too heavy-handed about its message is going to delimit the interpretive space for readers. Works, on the other hand, that are more multivocal and expressive and operate with a lighter touch, so to speak, are going to create more of a space for different people from different walks of life to find their way in.
Mhm.
And so, I think about this whole process not only at the level of the researcher scholar, but also who do I want to reach? And do I want them not just to know, but also to feel, right? And that's something that psychology generally hasn't done. The idea that psychology should be about the evocation of feeling is just alien to so much of what it does. But feeling is part of the human experience as well. And the idea that we as psychologists should only be or primarily be in the business of purveying knowledge in its cognitive form, drained of its evocative dimension, strikes me again as an unnecessary and problematic delimitation of its scope.
Mhm. Mhm. It limits the scope of psychology to knowing about things as opposed to knowing things.
I think
Like
that's right.
I can read about Paul Ricard and know about him a lot, but knowing him the way you did in person as a person, the
Yeah.
way it could affect his presence, could affect his encountering the
Yeah. Yeah.
person.
No, I think
Different.
I think that's right. So
And that's a very pervasive in the way we deal with the research participants in psychology. We
sure.
distance from them sufficiently such that first they are replaceable with each other and we know
Right.
about them as opposed
Yeah.
to getting to know them.
Yeah. No, and there's an interesting kind of paradox that I sometimes will try to get my students to understand. I'll sometimes ask a very simple question. How do you get to know somebody? How do you get to,
Mhm.
I say it's not a trick question. How do you get to, you spend time with them and you talk with them, and by degrees, you're going to develop your understanding of them.
Mhm.
And so the last thing you would do was be distant and keep yourself out of relation. And so that doesn't mean that we have to befriend all of our research participants and all the rest, but um, but insofar as the aim is the understanding of persons in all of their multidimensionality, a distance, more objectifying, dispassionate, behind the one-way mirror approach, that doesn't get us there. It doesn't get us there in real life. And there's no reason to assume it should get us there in the context of research and scholarship.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I just asked them to think about that. Why, given what you know about understanding, should psychology have moved in this direction? And by doing that, they can also begin to understand why psychology moved in that direction
Mhm.
and what it might have left out.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, so a lot of my work has come to deal with the relational dimension as well.
Right. I wanted to ask you about two challenges. One of them we already touched on, the challenge of so-called marginality, for lack of better term,
Yeah.
finding oneself in an unpopular position, and I find myself sometimes wanting to say something to a student, knowing that it will go against what they hear from some of my other colleagues or the majority of my colleagues.
Right.
What the student hears elsewhere. So I hesitate about what to say. Of course, it's good to be tactful sometimes, but just offering alternative ways of thinking. So that's one challenge. Let's call that the challenge of marginality. There's another challenge. I refer to it as the challenge of pedagogy. So training is easier actually when the subject of study, the subject matter, is alienated. So we find that a disadvantage if we want to relate to the subject matter. But in a sense, it is an advantage if we want to transfer our task to somebody else.
Right.
Then there's no place for them. So that's even better, because they can pick up the task and do it. The research assistant in an experimental task, for example, or if I want to give a questionnaire to somebody who would go and spread it around and collect hundreds responses.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, what the kind of psychology we are discussing now, I think the pedagogical dimension of it is much heavier. It takes more time, and it doesn't yield that kind of production as fast.
Right.
That's another challenge. So I wanted to ask you to address those. I know they are almost impossible challenges, but what do you think about them?
Yeah, yeah. Let me say, I'll say a little bit about the first one, the challenge of marginality. I mean, you used the word tact.
Mm.
And I actually think that's really important. I pull no punches, so to speak, when I teach about this stuff. And in fact, in my most recent iterations of history and theory, I actually have students read some of my own work very early on in the course so that they have a sense of where I stand. They might as well know that. I don't need to hide that. I'm very careful about saying to them, you need not think like me. This is a course where you have to develop your own ideas, but I'm not going to lie to you and tell you I'm infinitely pluralistic about psychology. I have a particular angle on it. Here's what it is. But I often have to intersperse presenting arguments about psychology with respectful interludes that say, hey, you know, I respect my colleagues and what they do, and there's a reason for why psychology has become what it's become, and there is significant progress being made, and there's no reason for a kind of all-out assault on what this discipline is. You know, to be purely destructive in that context, I think would just be demoralizing for students. I do want them to see alternatives out there. And it's also the case that until they get to my courses, they often don't even know that alternatives exist.
Mm-hmm.
And so I want them to know also just what's out there beyond the standard fare. And even that, I have to talk about tactfully. I say, look, you're in an undergraduate psychology department, you're taking your 10 or 12 courses. The courses you're taking here, the more or less standard fare, are basically the courses you'd be taking anywhere. So I'm not picking on our psychology department and so on. In very few places would, you know, narrative psychology be one of the required courses, if any. But at the same time, don't be deluded into thinking that what you've been exposed to represents the whole of the discipline. The American Psych Association, I might tell them, has 53 divisions or something like that. And that there are entire dimensions of psychological inquiry that you don't know. What I also do say to them, tactfully, is that you've all been socialized in a very particular way of thinking about psychology, thinking about methodology, and so on. And I will sometimes review that view and then ask them, is this what you think of psychology? And the answer is almost always, yeah, it's quantifiable, it's replicable, there's validity, there's all that stuff. And at that point, I can move and just say, well, it's not the only game in town. It's not the only game in town. So, and that sometimes comes as a shock to the system. Some don't take to it, but actually a lot of them do. And some of them, even at the 11th hour, I might see them as seniors, second semester seniors. They might be saying, geez, this is what I thought psychology was. I'm so glad to know that there are some other things to do. And through the years, there have been quite a few students who wound up asking the same kind of question that I asked, many years ago. How do I extend this? How do I find my path? How do I do this? And that's a challenge. That's a challenge. The good news about being in a relatively delimited, marginalized field like the one I'm in is that you do get to know a lot of the people in the field, and you can sometimes say to them, hey, students applying to your program, keep an eye out for him or her, could bring something good to the table, that kind of thing. In that sense, it's the world of theoretical and philosophical psychology, at least as it's practiced in the States and Canada. It's a relatively small one. The Midwinter Conference rarely doesn't draw more than 100 people. There are other conferences also at the intersection of philosophy and psychology, but that tends to be my home, so to speak. And in terms of the second part of the question that you asked, which has to do with working with students, yeah, you know, I tend not to have research students of the same sort that other people in my department have, most of whom have labs and, you know, might have a team of students working with them and generating data and coding and whatever they do. I tend to do more one-on-one work with students. You know, it's not unusual for me to work with students on their honors theses, for instance, or having gotten a taste of this alternative brand of psychology, they might come to me and say, you know, how do we continue this here? Can we do something with you? And so, you know, I've given lots of reading courses or tutorials through the years where students will learn how to do this kind of work. It's much more of a kind of apprentice situation, one might say. And that term applies as well to students working in a lab, but I think in a different way. Partly because they need to understand something about, you know, the historical and philosophical backdrop of this mode of inquiry. They need to know something about the varieties of inquiry that are employed, and so forth and so on. So, you know, for a given honors thesis, for instance, I haven't done one for a while, somebody might study 4 people over the course of a semester or even a year. And that will also alert them to some of the challenges of qualitative inquiry. On the one hand, qualitative inquiry isn't committed to generality or generalization in the same way that much of quantitative or nomothetic inquiry is. But even when there's an N of 1, I can refer again to the case of my mother. What I write about her isn't only about her. Right? She's an instance of some broader category of phenomena. And of course, one has to be cautious about overgeneralizing or over-extrapolating and saying more about a given phenomenon than the data warrant. But nonetheless, there's much that can be learned through small ends, so to speak, about human phenomena and about what's possible. Right? So, yeah, it's very, very intensive work. Students will sometimes discover just how intensive it is when they record an hour-long interview and see that it's 30 or 40 pages long, and all of a sudden they're faced with the task of making sense of that. How do I do that? Where do I begin? And there's no formula.
Right.
I mean, there are qualitative methods that are as formulaic in their own way as other methods. So, but there's lots of different ways in. There's no set path that qualitative inquirers follow in carrying out their work, and students need to know that.
For students who are beginning in this way of thinking qualitative studies, for example, would you recommend them beginning with reading about methods, the philosophy of science, philosophy of qualitative, I mean, top-down conceptual work, or do you give them a concrete case to study in the beginning? Do you begin with data, or is it better to begin with the scope of these kinds of studies and how they differ from nomothetic studies?
I've tended more towards the former, that is, giving the kind of philosophical and historical context. But more recently, I try to do both. I try to give students some feel for why qualitative inquiry, or more broadly work, I mean, a term that's more and more being used is work in the psychological humanities. Right? It's important they have some kind of context for understanding how that happens. Otherwise, it'll just seem mystifying, right?
Right.
But it is also important for them to see some instances of it relatively early on, so that it doesn't come off as, you know, I use this term cautiously, merely philosophical endeavor. Right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
It's not that. You know, one of the books that I teach in history and theory very early on, and it's not because it's the earliest in history, I teach Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's book. Right? And it's partly to show like what you can learn about the human experience through a very different kind of approach, right? It's not a novel, although they often use that word mistakenly. It's a work of psychological literature, and he's deeply involved in the phenomena that he's exploring. So, you know, it's not that dispassionate, detached inquiry we talked about before. It is not about replication, God knows, and so forth and so on. And so, you know, it's a relatively simple point of entry. It's qualitative inquiry of a particular sort, and you can learn from it, and
Absolutely.
you can also feel.
Right. Right.
So it's not unusual for a student to say like, "Wow, that's just I actually liked this book."
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, it's a book that I would have read on my own.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's fascinating and disturbing and evocative, and so that's also my way of letting them see that psychologists do that also.
Right. Right.
They do that also.
This can be done.
Yeah.
When I read about, I haven't read the pieces themselves, but I read about your there was an article or chapter called the Drive Back Home, where you talk about your memories with your father and also your experiences with your mother. I thought, wow, this will be such a great way to begin a course, and then say, okay, put this next to some articles having to do with the natural scientific studies of dementia, for example, or loss or grief with measurements, and see, and then see what is the result of these two types of studies, and then linking them later to their philosophical foundation, where they come from. And actually showing that one side, one of these two sides is more aware of its own philosophical assumptions and its origins, where it's coming from.
Yeah, and I think that's right. I had my students read a piece on my mother the first week of school this year for the first time in history and theory. Partly for the reason that you suggest. Here's an example of it. So yeah, and you know, the other thing that's important for them to see, and this is certainly true of the piece that I did on my father, the piece I've done on my mother, and they're not just about me, right? I mean, I'll say to students, when you do this kind of work, it has to be both about you and not about you, right? There's no reason why the work I'm doing on my mother, there's no reason why people would be interested in either her or me, right? They're interested in phenomena, and they want to be able to an experience. They want to be able to read about it in a way that somehow reaches them. And so, you know, I'll sometimes say to students, I see myself as a kind of site for inquiry. I don't want to exclude my own experience because I've learned a lot about the world through it. You know, I've learned an immense amount about memory and identity and all the rest through those dozen years with my mother. The last thing I'd want to do is kind of excise my own participation in that. But I also don't want to call undue attention to myself as writer or as, because that can just become an exercise in narcissism, and I don't want to do that. So, you know, learning how to do this kind of work, even if it's about ourselves or about family, and how to create not that distance, but that kind of proper space. That's a challenge, and it's another challenge that students really need to work on oftentimes.
Yeah. I wanted to mention you reminded me of another book that is not ostensibly psychological, but it has a lot of psychology in it, and it is very emotional. And my reading of it was very emotionally, it was very affecting on me. It was C.S. Lewis's A Grief Observed, and he talks about his experience of losing his wife. And he talks about going to places, and everywhere he goes, he can't he keeps remembering him, being reminded of her.
Right.
But and then he says, there is one place that I can't escape from, and I'm reminded of her the most, and that's my own body. So that's, again, the body being the site of knowing and remembering.
Yeah.
You mentioned that generality can result from qualitative studies with n of 1. But at the same time, it seems like generality, universality, finding something that is universal, is not the explicit aim of qualitative study when we examine one person, the experience of one person. But incidentally, it happens that we stumble upon something that is not just about this one person.
Right.
How would you describe that? That generality that is that we stumble upon it. It's not the aim. We want to really get to know this one person, but somehow it is not just about the person.
Let me give you an example that's a recent one that deals with grief. Okay? And it'll also give you some sense of how it is that in some of what I'm doing, I'm trying to move beyond the written word alone. Okay? There's a well-known composer at Holy Cross. His name is Osvaldo Golijov, Argentinian composer. And he's done a lot of work with an ensemble called the Silk Road Ensemble. It's an ensemble that was formed a number of years ago by the cellist Yo-Yo Ma. And so Osvaldo recently composed a work for the Silk Road Ensemble that was based upon I don't know exactly what genre to call it, but based upon a book by the Israeli novelist Davood Grossman, and that book was called Falling Out of Time. And it was a book about the death of his son in the context of war. The concert was scheduled to premiere at Holy Cross sometime in the fall. And a couple of us were contacted at one point to see whether or not there might be some kind of program of outreach to the alumni community that would allow them to participate in the concert and in the book, that fed the concert, so to speak, from afar. And so what wound up happening was, in advance of the concert, we had all these people read the book. And along with a colleague of mine, Leah Hager-Cohen, who is a writer, a novelist, and she's also written nonfiction, we approached two of our close friends, both of whom had been at Holy Cross for as many as 40 years. One of them had lost his daughter at age 12 to brain cancer. The other had lost his son much more recently to an accidental overdose that was related to terrible, terrible back pain due to his work as a contractor and so on. And we sat with them for an hour and a half and basically talked about the phenomenology of grief in all of its particularity. The grief that was experienced by Davood Grossman in the wake of losing his son to war, and the grief of a parent losing a 12-year-old girl to cancer, and the grief of these other people losing their son, they all talk something of a common language, but their experiences are radically different as well. There is no single grief that's experienced. It's radically singular, radically particular. That doesn't mean that no generality is possible, right? Because they could talk to one another about ideas like, strictly speaking, it doesn't end. Or it's something that is such a radical assault to the system that one can't possibly imagine it unless and until one experiences it for oneself. And so in this four-way conversation, myself and Leah and these two other people, there were lots of points of common ground, but also lots of points of difference. And the aim is never to say, this is what grief is. It is to say, this is what grief can be. And in fact, by learning about its plurality of forms, its plurality of sources, the plurality of feelings evoked, the plurality of strategies for dealing with it, we're going to be able to understand that much more about this phenomenon in all of its multidimensionality. You know, for some people, for instance, the anniversary of a death day is a profound kind of ritualistic return. And for others, it's not. Because there's no reason for why this day should be any more powerful than the other 364 days a year, which are filled with as much grief. And so, you know, those kind of differences are important to know. So, you know, a lot of qualitative inquiry is about the possible, right? Which doesn't mean cordoned off from the actual, right? It doesn't mean that it's merely possible, because it was actual, and it's actual for this person and this person and this person in a different way. Let's learn as much about that as possible. Right?
And
that was a long-winded way of answering your question.
No, it was great.
So you know, so here's the other thing. One other thing. So there was the interview, then there was the concert, and then I sat down with 5 members of the Silk Road Ensemble to talk about how it is that one moves from the experience of grief to a work of literature to a work of music. How is it that music might be able to say something about grief in a way that goes beyond the written word, right? Or in a different way, maybe not beyond, but adjacent to, right? And that's partly because music is a different language, and it's a language of feeling. Not exclusively. I don't want to separate music from knowledge or from the cognitive, but it's clear that a song cycle of the sort that Osvaldo Golijov created is doing something different than the novel on which it's based. Both of them ultimately have their roots in experience. Right? So I'm also interested in what psychologists can do beyond the scope of the written word in order to be faithful to experience. And this semester, for instance, I taught a seminar called Psychology /as Art. Let's see what it can do. And let's have students do projects that are about phenomena in the world, using as many mediums as they find interesting and appropriate that can speak to those phenomena. It was good. It was fun, you know. And I still have to tell them, though, don't assume you're going to be able to do this if you go to grad school in developmental psychology or something. It's not what they do. But so you don't want to promise too much.
Right. Yeah, that's true. And one of this attitude that you're describing, it will never face problems like the replicability crisis, because the aim is not to fixate or to pinpoint the phenomenon in one of its possible forms. It is actually the less we are able to replicate, the more exciting it becomes.
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, you know, what leapt to mind is, you know, a piece that my friend Ken Gergen did way back in 1973 that caused quite a stir. It was called Social Psychology as History. And, you know, I mean, he said a bunch of things in that paper, but at the core of it was the idea that a lot of what people are observing, even in the most rigorously executed social psychology experiments, are not eternal verities, but are products of history. And you wouldn't expect the same findings at some other point in history or some other point, some other place, and so on. I mean, insofar as human reality is lived in language and culture and history, there are bound to be features, lots of features that are not replicable, right? So, you know, what has emerged at a crisis for the universalizing or aspiringly universalizing psychologist just isn't one for people who are cultural psychologists or more interpretive psychologists and so forth. So it's interesting there that the very idea of a crisis is itself a product of psychology's history and its commitments and so on.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I want to turn a bit towards your own work. And if you want to introduce, if somebody say, I'm interested in getting to know your work more closely, do you have a sequence that I could begin with? You would say, I begin here, and then I can work my way through a series of books or articles. And I also wanted to mention your, I don't know, top 3, 5, whatever that number is,
right,
of the works that are most prominent in your mind.
You know, if somebody really wanted to get a sense of kind of how I got formed as a psychologist, what are the initial ideas that kind of drove me to do this kind of work, I'd still point them towards rewriting the self, despite the fact that it's old. It strikes me now as being somewhat verbose in the way that younger scholars can be, and so on. But it covers a lot of ground, and it does it in a way that I can look back on with some measure of fondness and say, you know, hey, that was okay. If people were more interested in some of the more personalized stuff I've done, yeah, I could recommend, for instance, my book Hindsight, more recent book. Takes on a lot of similar issues to rewriting the self, but does it in a somewhat different way. There's stuff in there on my father. There's not stuff in that book on my mother. But I could also recommend some of the pieces I had done on my mother. If I wanted people to understand or to have some exposure to a somewhat different dimension of inquiry than what we've been talking about, I would direct them to The Priority of the Other. And the Priority of the Other is a book that's very near and dear to my heart, that I think has not gathered the kind of readership that I would have liked to see it gather. I still believe just about everything that I said in it, and I see it as a groundbreaking book for me, a book that took me in a very different kind of direction. And so if somebody was interested in exploring in a somewhat more philosophical and at times even theological way some fundamental problems having to do with ethics and responsibility and moral life, and I would direct them to that. I would just say to them, depending on their level of preparation, well, hold on tight. Some of it could be rough going. In terms of the stuff I've done that's most accessible to a broader readership, it's probably the book Hindsight. In terms of more recent semi-comprehensive statements about what I do, there's the piece that you just read, Toward a Poetics of the Other. I did another piece on narrative hermeneutics for an edited volume in Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. I have a piece coming out shortly called Psychology as Literature, which is coming out in a volume edited by Jeff Sugarman and Jack Martin, that's devoted to the psychological humanities. And I'm also in the process of doing a small book, for a theoretical and philosophical psychology series called something like A New Vision for Psychology Toward the Psychological Humanities. And that will be an attempt to synthesize a lot of the work I've been doing over the past 35 years or so into compact form. So that book will come out sometime within the year, as will the book on my mother, which carries what might seem like an obscure title. The title is tentatively, Do I Look at You with Love? And that's a question that my mother asked me after one of the many times in which I had to tell her, I'm your son. I'm Mark Freeman. I'm here to see you. And it would often lead to a conversation that would lead her to try to place me. And one of them led to that question.
Wow.
So do I look at you with love? And that book carries the subtitle, The Tragicomedy of Dementia. So I'm writing it as a tragicomedy. I'm not going to skip over the tragic parts. There were elements or dimensions of her experience, our experience, that were brutal and terrible. And there were aspects that were beautiful and wondrous. And I need to be able to tell that story in as full measure a way as I possibly can. So I don't know, I don't want to sound weird about it, but it's hard for me to single stuff out. It really has been a kind of evolution. You've probably seen my CV. I mean, I've written a lot of stuff through the years, so it's hard to pick this out or that out.
I understand.
That's kind of where I am on this.
Right. And who are some of the authors that you keep going back to? I noticed that Stephen Tolman is somebody who has played a central role in your...
Yeah, Tolman, and that's partly just because of getting to know him in graduate school, although I wasn't, a close student of his, but I studied with him and did have the great good fortune of having conversations with him. I brought him to Holy Cross at one point. Tolman, Ricoeur,
Heidegger,
Charles Taylor, Heidegger, Gadamer, Iris Murdoch, Simone Weil, lots of them. It's a curious mix, actually. Some of it's continental philosophy, some of it's not. And I'm also inspired by the work of my colleagues, especially my colleagues in theoretical and philosophical psychology. I'm not going to name them all because I'm sure I'll forget some of them, but we're all in this together, and we have somewhat different repertoires of authors that move us and that we draw on, but we also do draw on one another. And we do that both explicitly, sometimes in the form of citation, but we also do it over meals and drinks and late night exchanges where we're really hacking our way through ideas in exactly the way we did this past weekend. We sit and we challenge one another. And so, those are some. William James, Freud, to some extent Jung. I am attracted to some of those classical sources, not because I believe every word they say, but because there's real brilliance in them, and they get us to think about things we wouldn't otherwise think about, and so on. So I'm not an analyst, I'm not a therapist, but I read a lot of psychoanalysis. I sometimes write about it. When I want to think about things like religious experience or mystical experience or aesthetic experience, I'll go to somebody like William James, who I continue to just regard as just a cool and admirable thinker with a wide-angle lens on the human experience and able to write some good things to boot, So, I mean, there's lots of other people I draw on. You see who's in those references. I also don't limit my references to psychologists and philosophers, I draw on works of literature. I draw on literary theorists. I draw on essayists. And sometimes that makes my work harder to locate. I don't sort of identify myself with a particular school as much as some of my colleagues do. I'm a hermeneutical psychologist, or I'm a phenomenologist. I go where I need to go at a given time, and that might make some of my stuff more difficult to read into place. Like, where's he coming from? How's he doing Heidegger and Iris Murdoch? Like, gosh, they have nothing to do with one another. Well, for me, they kind of do. I have to make the case. Obviously, I can't just throw it in there like some motley salad. But
makes sense.
Yeah, you can. I wish I could show you my shelves. I mean, this is my lab.
Right.
This is my place.
Is there an author, I'm curious, is there somebody who you disagree with strongly, but you also keep reading? Kind of like an arch nemesis.
An arch nemesis. Not really. I'm not too much of a nemesis type, and
That was overly dramatic, probably.
but even that is partly about my own quote evolution as a scholar. I would say I used to be more in the critical or nemesis mode for the first part of my career, and less so in the second part. Less, what I want to do more nowadays is just do the work rather than talk about what's bad about this theorist or bad about that theory. And
Yeah,
so
I'm also learning that slowly. Yeah.
Interestingly enough, one of the people I was in explicit debate with off and on for a number of years was this guy, Ken Gergen, who I mentioned before, who's a prominent psychologist and who's also become a good friend. We've done stuff together with our colleague Ruth Ellen Josselson, our colleague and friend Ruth Ellen Josselson, in advancing the cause of qualitative inquiry and so on. But my early exposure to social constructionism and certain forms of post-structuralist thinking in psychology, a lot of that stuff didn't work for me. I found it somewhat too relativistic, occasionally somewhat too nihilistic, and found myself, in a weird way, adopting a more conservative position, especially epistemologically, than some people might have thought. Because they would have lumped us all together. Oh, you do this, you must be a constructionist, and you think whatever. So, I can remember, for instance, a panel that we did at the APA called something like Postmodernism and Its Malcontents. Right. So I was a malcontent. Louis Sass was a malcontent, and Ken Gergen was our discussant who had to defend himself and so on. So, there was that. In some of the memory literature, it's not like I have enemies in the literature, but there was a kind of dominating approach in much of the literature that basically said memory is inevitably it's not just reconstruction, but it's distortion, it's corruption. There's no getting back to the authentic experience. Consequently, everything we might say about the past is a fiction or a construction, and so on. And that could come from an empirical or empiricist psychology, emphasizing distortion and all the rest, or it could come from a more constructivist psychology. What we make of the past is a fiction. And once again, I wasn't comfortable thinking about things in that way. So, for instance, in the book Hindsight, I want to say there are aspects of the reconstruction of the past that can give us insight into the past in a way that's patently unavailable in the flux of the present. So let's not assume that present experience is, the real thing and memory just some kind of falsification that's imposed on it. Let's not think about it that way. And I also said to some of the constructionists or constructivists, let's not think about the inevitability of interpretation as involving a necessary fictionalization of experience, because it may be that it's only through making, only through poiesis, that we're able to discover things about the world, right? So, again, I'm generally not in the business of pointing fingers at this or that psychologist I disagree with. If I do that at all, it's going to be about positions rather than people. But for the most part, I try to work in a more positive mode and carry out the work that I'm most committed to doing, rather than spending as much time as I once did in the mode of critique.
Great.
Yeah.
I think that's also more efficient way of spending one's time.
Yeah.
And defining one's position as just purely in terms of antagonism. And
right.
opposite. Yeah.
It's less redundant also. I mean, there's just so many times you can repeat the same arguments or identify the same targets. The positive dimension of my work, for instance, in the priority of the other and some of the other things, it's new ground, I mean, even there are kind of quiet targets, right? The egocentric nature of much of psychology, the fact that much of our experience is belied or much of the way we think about the world is belied by our actual experience in the world, that kind of thing. So, there's an element of critique there, but it's not the main tone of the book. It's rather, here are some tools that might allow us to think about the world in a somewhat different way than we're used to doing. Let's see how they work. Let's see how they work.
Right. Okay, as the final word, anything if we didn't touch on it, we should, or any, advice for junior scholars, teachers, any word of encouragement, any kind of advice that you maybe find yourself giving regularly?
Yeah. It's not unusual for me to say to students who want to carry out work in this area, it's something of an uphill battle. There's a good chance you're going to find people who will either reject what you're doing or just find it too alien to the center of psychology, alien in relation to the center of psychology. For that reason, you have to be politically aware of what the discipline is and isn't. But I'd hardly be one to steer them away from trying to do it, because I remain convinced through it all that if one really has passions about their work, and one is dedicated to doing the work, and one is wise about submitting the work and all the rest, that there's a good chance you're going to be able to break in some way. And, you don't want to hold out false promise. Will they get a job at a place like this? Who knows? And so, in any given year, there are going to be few opportunities and all the rest. So again, we have to be realistic, but more of this work is being done now than ever. We have a Society for Qualitative Inquiry in Psychology. There's the Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. There's the Journal Theory in Psychology. There's Narrative Inquiry. There's the Journal Qualitative Psychology. There's the Humanistic Psychologist. There's Culture in Psychology. So in some ways, the venues that are out there at this point, and pretty widely traveled, well-traveled, I think say something quite positive about where the field has come. So even while it's bound to be an uphill battle, it's one in which they may well prevail if all goes well. It's going to depend on where people land also. One of the things that people sometimes do is they have to split themselves in two. They have to do the kind of work that is going to be expected and accepted in more mainstream outlets, because for some psychologists, those are the outlets that one has to publish in. And so they might, hold a space for some of their passions over to the side, so to speak, for purely pragmatic reasons. And I wouldn't fault them for that at all. I mean, as I said to you a couple of times, I was very lucky for being able to do what I do without having to split myself in that way. But that's not always possible. That's not always possible. So that, again, requires just some awareness of what's out there, what the expectations are, and so on. The other thing I would say is get in the game sooner rather than later. The Meeting for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology, lots of grad students there. There have been undergraduates there. Sometimes getting in the game seems way more daunting than it actually is. To get yourself conference schedule and so forth, that's a doable thing. Even finding out who to study with, not only what's the best program, but learn about who is where, learn about exactly what work they're doing, and whether they're taking on students and that kind of thing. So you got to do your homework, and that's always the case. But it probably takes a little more digging in this area to just find out who is doing what where, and where they're getting their work into print and all the rest. So both passion and pragmatism.
Right.
You
mentioned that you were lucky to get a position that allows you to do what you enjoy. But I think that it's not just you who was lucky. the entire field was lucky that because some people, including myself, managed to work hard and focused, so that the field, the rest of us, could also gain and learn from your insights.
Yeah.
And what happens when somebody devotes their career to this type of psychology? So
yeah,
so
well, I
great.
appreciate hearing that. And you know, I'm still an active writer, but I'm as interested these days in kind of sponsoring other people, especially younger scholars, and especially through the editorial work I do. You know, because those are the people who are going to carry the torch and are going to continue infiltrating the field. And so I say that, you know, not in the name of martyrdom or sacrifice or anything of that sort, but being able to support younger scholars and help them get their work into print, for instance, in the book series I edit. That to me is as important as the next, you know, cool piece I might do, because it's more about the future of the discipline and keeping some of this stuff alive. I think it's real important. And, you know, recent meetings of the Society for Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology have been really encouraging. You know, there's still a bunch of us old white guys, for lack of a better way of putting it, involved. But there's also a lot of other people, younger people, more women, I think, than ever. It's more plural, it's more diverse. We still have a ways to go, but, you know, a lot of energy, a lot of intelligence in the next generation and the generation after that, and that's very encouraging. It really is encouraging. So I don't know exactly what you do in your work. I know a little bit about it, of course, since we can all Google. But whatever you do, keep the flame alive. You know, in your own way. I mean, it doesn't have to be hermeneutics or this, or, you know, it's thinking carefully, deeply, critically about the human condition, about the discipline, about the state of the world. You know, wherever people are coming from and can contribute to those larger causes, all the better.
Right. I agree. All right, Professor Freeman.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this interview, for taking
Yeah.
the time.
Good to meet you. You've been a good partner in dialogue. Thanks, Davood.
Thank you.
Okay. Take care.